Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, wrap yourself in the nearest blanket-like object, and settle in for another slow, mildly disappointing stroll through the past. I'm your narrator for the evening, still tired, still unimpressed by history's life choices. And tonight, we're drifting quietly into the very damp, very unpleasant world of pirates. And before you picture anything glamorous, let me just gently pop that bubble. We're not talking about the cool Hollywood pirates with dramatic coats and impossibly good eyeliner. No, tonight's story features the real ones. The ones who smelled like moldy socks dipped in seawater, lived on food that would be illegal today, and spent most of their days just trying not to die of something preventable. So lie back, breathe out, and let your brain go pleasantly soft as we drift through the extremely average, frequently sticky reality of piracy. Trust me, you wouldn't last 7 days in this world. But luckily, you don't have to. You can stay in bed while I walk you through every grimy little detail. Let's begin. People love imagining pirates as these dramatic, larger-than-life figures. They picture Blackbeard with flaming fuses stuck in his beard like a nautical metalhead. Or maybe Captain Jack Sparrow, stumbling around but somehow always charming. But real pirates, they mostly looked like men who'd been kicked out of multiple taverns for hygiene violations. Imagine someone who hasn't bathed in weeks, whose skin has turned into crispy, sun-roasted leather, and who is missing anywhere from 3 to 20 teeth. That's your average pirate. Basically a dental disaster with a side interest in petty theft. The clothes weren't great either. No stylish, flowing coats, just ragged, salt-stiff jackets that smelled like the world's saddest fish market. Hats were usually stolen, boots were sometimes optional, and parrots, well, parrots weren't exactly lining up to sit on the shoulder of a man who smelled like damp despair. And yet, people still became pirates. The question is, why? The short answer is, life wasn't going well. At all. Most pirates didn't wake up and say, yes, time to pursue my dream of maritime villainy. No, they started as regular sailors. Merchant sailors, navy sailors, fishermen. Basically the early modern equivalent of someone working a minimum wage shift with no lunch break. Their days were long, the pay was terrible, and the management style could best be described as lightly tyrannical. If you complained on a Navy ship, the officer might inspire you with a whip. If you complained on a merchant ship, the captain might not pay you for 6 months. Sailors were treated like disposable sea furniture. So when a pirate crew came along and said, hey, want better wages, slightly better food, and maybe even some democracy, a lot of sailors were like, you know what? Let's try crime. And even the ones who didn't volunteer sometimes got recruited anyway. Pirates had a very streamlined HR system. It consisted of 2 approaches. The first was the friendly pitch. Equal pay, more freedom, no whippings unless absolutely necessary. The second method was less friendly. Congratulations, you're hired. Please step aboard or lose a limb. Oddly enough, many forced recruits stayed because, compared to the Navy, pirate ships were nicer, which really says something dark about early modern governments. Pirates elected their captains. They voted on decisions. They even had compensation plans for injuries. Honestly, compared to most European monarchies, pirates were running a surprisingly modern workplace, just with more rum and fewer HR pamphlets. Speaking of rum, let's drift gently onto a pirate ship. Imagine stepping onto one of these vessels. The first thing that hits you isn't the view, it's the smell, because this ship has not been cleaned since roughly never. The air is a layered cocktail of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, damp wood, and a hint of existential sorrow. Everything is sticky, everything is damp, everything is slightly worse than you expect. The sleeping arrangements were basically hammocks crammed so tightly together that you could accidentally cuddle your crewmate without meaning to. Privacy was a myth. Your alone time was essentially closing your eyes and pretending no one else existed. And the food? Oh, the food. If you're snacking right now, feel free to pause. Pirates lived on biscuits so old they needed their own gravestones. Meat so salted it could probably survive another decade. Peas that dissolved into a green mush resembling sadness. And water that tasted like a wet wooden barrel had slowly given up on life inside it. Fresh fruit was extremely rare, which meant scurvy was extremely common because it turns out you need vitamins to function. Shocking. Bathing? That wasn't happening. Bathing used fresh water. Fresh water was for drinking. So pirates didn't bathe for weeks, sometimes months. Their clothes didn't get washed either, so after a while, everything on board became a single shared smell. The only bath you might get was falling overboard, which was not recommended because the ocean also contained sharks, and the captain did not pause the voyage for Greg's bath time emergency. Teeth were not doing well either. Dental hygiene was basically don't chew too hard. If a tooth got infected, the ship's surgeon, a man with a knife and a dream, would remove it using whatever tool was nearby. Sometimes a knife, sometimes a hammer, sometimes a crewmate willing to yank things. It was a do-it-yourself approach, and it went exactly as you expected. Sickness was everywhere, because of course it was. Dysentery, fever, infections, you name it. The surgeon tried his best, but his medical kit usually consisted of a saw, a thread of questionable cleanliness, and a comforting amount of rum. Amputations were common. Good outcomes were not. And yet, compared to the official Navy, pirates were sometimes healthier. They actually ate more fresh food when they could. They stopped at islands. They took breaks, which again makes pirates sound like the more responsible option. Early modern governments truly did not pass the vibe check. Despite their reputation, pirate ships were not lawless chaos. They had rules, lots of rules, written agreements called articles. These included things like no fighting on board, no stealing from fellow pirates, equal voting rights, and fair distribution of loot. They even had quiet hours. Yes, pirates. Dangerous, rugged pirates had bedtime rules. Imagine Blackbeard wandering around the deck whispering, "All right, lads, lanterns out." Punishments for breaking the rules ranged from losing treasure to being left on a deserted island with a pistol and one bullet, which sounds dramatic, but honestly, some pirates probably treated that as a paid vacation. As for treasure, yeah, that's another Hollywood lie. Real pirate treasure wasn't gold coins pouring out of chests like a slot machine malfunction. Most loot was boring cargo: wheat, tobacco, rum, cloth, rice, tools, more rum. If they found coins, great. If not, they still took whatever they could sell. So after dividing the spoils, each pirate usually got enough money to spend it all on one night of extremely irresponsible behavior in a port tavern. Then they'd return to the ship broke and ready to do it all over again. Combat wasn't glamorous either. Pirate battles looked nothing like movies. Cannons were inaccurate, guns misfired, swords were dull, and most pirates were too exhausted or malnourished to leap dramatically through the air. Usually the goal was to scare the other ship into surrendering. Fighting meant broken loot, which meant fewer tavern nights later. So, intimidation was the preferred strategy. If a ship surrendered, everyone relaxed. If a ship resisted, the pirates got irritated, and everything became mildly inconvenient. Between raids, life was surprisingly chill. Pirates spent their time gambling, telling stories, carving bits of wood, fixing the ship, drinking, and complaining about the food. Sometimes they danced in a way that can only be described as if chickens had rhythm. It wasn't glamorous, but it passed the time. Despite all this, a pirate's career was usually short, not because they retired with a pension, but because they died, quit, got captured, or realized they hated everyone on board. The average pirate career lasted less than 2 years. That's shorter than some people's gym memberships. But pirates kept joining crews anyway, because compared to their other options, poverty, abusive captains, zero rights, piracy was the slightly less terrible version of maritime suffering. And that's pirate life. Damp, smelly, disappointing, and guaranteed to ruin your teeth. You, lying in bed right now, would not have survived the first week, but that's okay. You don't have to. You can stay in bed while I walk you through every grimy little detail. Let's begin.
All right, let's drift a little deeper now. You're probably comfortable, hopefully warm, maybe halfway melted into your pillow. Perfect. Because we're about to glide into the lives of a few actual pirates. Not the romantic, whimsword versions, more like men who made choices, and none of them were good. Let's start with the poster boy of pirate marketing, Blackbeard. If Hollywood had to pick one pirate to be the CEO of Pirate Branding Incorporated, they'd pick him. He's dramatic, imposing, and has a name that basically feels like a Halloween costume. But real Blackbeard, Edward Teach, was not some mystical creature rising from ocean fog. He was a guy. A very tall guy with a very large beard and a very deep commitment to theatrics. Blackbeard understood something most early modern men didn't. Branding matters. If you want people to fear you, you need a look. So he built one. He grew a beard large enough to be its own weather system. He braided it. He tied ribbons in it. And, famously, before battle, he stuck slow-burning fuses in it and lit them. Imagine the smell for a moment. Burning rope, burning beard hair, burning ego, probably. All while he looked at other sailors like, "Yeah, this is normal. Why do you ask?" People surrendered to him not because he was some supernatural monster, but because they saw a large man with smoke coming out of his face and thought, you know what? Let's not test this. Despite the image, Blackbeard didn't actually like fighting. Very few pirates did. Fighting gets you killed and kills your income, which for pirates was basically the same thing. He preferred intimidation over violence. In fact, he was known for letting captured sailors go unharmed more often than not. Very polite for a man who accessorized with fire. Daily life for Blackbeard was just as mundane as every other pirate. He still had the same boring food, the same seasick crewmates, the same issues with water barrels turning into biology experiments. The only difference was that he could grow a beard that doubled as battlefield smoke effects. Congratulations to him, I guess. But let's float away from him for a moment and move over to someone a little less famous, but infinitely more chaotic. Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart. If pirates had superlatives like a high school yearbook, he would have won most likely to overachieve in crime. He captured more ships than any other pirate in history, not because he loved stealing necessarily, but because he was strangely good at it. A natural talent. Some people are born to write poetry. Some are born to lead armies. Roberts was apparently born to look at a fully loaded merchant ship and say, "Mine." Roberts didn't even want to be a pirate at first. He was forced into it, which is ironic considering he then spent the rest of his career being better at piracy than most of the people who chose it willingly. Once he accepted the job, because sometimes life hands you lemons and says, "Rob these people," he leaned into it in the calmest, most responsible way possible. He created rules. He kept order. He made his crew dress nicely. He even wore fine clothes during battle, because nothing says stable leader like standing under cannon fire while dressed like you're going to a very fancy dinner party. Despite his success, Roberts' actual day-to-day life was just pirate reality. Salt and everything, crew members yelling, food that tasted like driftwood, and the constant background hum of someone coughing aggressively. Let's drift to another figure now. Someone whose story floats quietly through pirate lore like a half-forgotten rumor. Calico Jack Rackham. Jack was not a great pirate. I want to make that clear in the gentlest way. His contributions were mostly aesthetic. He wore bright clothes, hence the calico. That's basically his entire personality. He liked flashy fabric and mediocre decision-making. But Calico Jack is remembered mainly because of the two women in his crew, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. They're the actual interesting part of his story. Jack himself was sort of an accessory. Anne Bonny was a pirate because she wanted to be. She ran away from her life in the Caribbean, joined Jack, and never looked back. Anne was apparently the only person on Jack's ship who consistently made good decisions during fights, which says a lot about the crew's overall competence. She reportedly yelled at the men for being cowards while they hid during battles. Very empowering if you ignore the part where everyone involved was committing crimes. Mary Read's story is even stranger. She spent years disguised as a man just to work and fight without anyone bothering her about it. Then she became a pirate and did the same thing, except this time she also had to deal with Calico Jack's questionable leadership. Between Anne and Mary, the two of them were basically the only functional adults on the ship. Jack, meanwhile, was mostly busy being decorative. Life on their ship was no less gross or uncomfortable than on any other pirate vessel. Even the famous ones had the same issues: fleas, rats, bad food, worse water, constant dampness, and conversations that likely consisted of 80% complaining. Let's move on now, drifting like a tired seagull to the infamous Captain Kidd. William Kidd started as a privateer, which is basically a pirate with a permission slip from the government. He wasn't supposed to attack everyone, just the enemies of England. But unfortunately, the line between privateering and piracy was about as clear as a foggy windshield. Eventually, Kidd crossed it. Whether by accident or design is still debated. He claimed innocence. Other people claimed he was lying. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, sitting on a damp barrel muttering to itself. Kidd was captured, of course, and in classic government fashion, England decided to make an example out of him. Nothing says public relations campaign like executing a man in front of a crowd and then hanging his tarred corpse by the river as a reminder to everyone else. Very chill, very normal, extremely sleep-inducing justice system. But again, despite all these dramatic endings, pirates spent most of their time not fighting, not capturing ships, not dueling on moonlit decks. They spent it waiting, drifting, repairing ropes, staring at the horizon, trying not to sneeze on someone. Pirate life was one long sequence of bore down, interrupted by brief moments of, oh no, this again. Let's float over to the less talked about pirates for a moment. The ones whose names rarely appear in movies, but who lived the same uncomfortable reality. People like Charles Vane, who was such a terrible co-worker that even other pirates voted him out. That's impressive, honestly. If a group of criminals who live on a floating garbage dump think you're too much, that's a real achievement. Or Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, who left behind a wealthy life and family for piracy, even though he had no idea how ships worked. None. This man bought a ship and hired a crew because he thought being a pirate sounded relaxing. It was not relaxing. He was so bad at his job that eventually even Blackbeard used him as a sidekick out of pity. Stede Bonnet was essentially the world's first pirate influencer. Great vibe, zero skills. Yet even he lived the same miserable routine. The sea, the dampness, the food that tasted like a dare, the crewmates constantly coughing on everything. Pirates were equal in their suffering. Crime did not make the food taste more magical. Let's take a slow breath and drift into the world of Chinese piracy for a moment. Because yes, it wasn't just a European mess. And honestly, East Asian pirate history was sometimes even more organized. One example is Qing Shi, one of the most powerful pirates in history. She commanded tens of thousands of pirates, entire fleets. Imagine being so good at piracy that you run it like a corporate empire. Qing Shi had regulations, strict ones. No abuse, no stealing from civilians, no unauthorized violence. Pirates who broke the rules were punished with remarkable efficiency. And despite commanding more ships than probably all European pirates combined, her daily life still had the same basic suffering: damp wood, bad food, and men who couldn't follow instructions. The sea is the great equalizer. Even the strongest pirate queen can't escape moisture. So as we drift further through these stories, a theme appears. Pirates were not mythical beings, but deeply tired men and women living in very cramped.
So, drifting back into the soft gloom of the 17th century seas, let's keep floating with our wonderfully miserable band of ocean criminals. At this point, you've probably figured out that pirates weren't exactly living the tropical Instagram fantasy we like to imagine. No hammocks under palm trees, no overly tanned Captain Jack lookalikes doing sword flips for fun. Mostly, it was a lot of boredom, sweat, and a slow decline into various forms of physical decay. Real cozy bedtime stuff. One of the quietest details about pirate life is how shockingly repetitive it was. Unless you were boarding a ship or being boarded yourself, which honestly didn't happen as often as movies want us to believe, you spent most days doing nothing. Just sailing, very slowly, in mediocre weather, staring at the horizon like it owed you money. It's that kind of existential monotony that probably made half the crew question their life choices, though they were already too far in to back out. The sea wasn't exactly known for its generous refund policy. And because boredom loves company, the average pirate day also included simple chores that somehow felt like punishment. Swabbing the deck wasn't a glamorous montage, it was more like wiping the world's largest, constantly damp kitchen floor, over and over. If you ever try to picture pirates, don't imagine daring rebels. Picture tired custodians with weapons. Meals didn't help the mood either. Pirate food was basically a hostile negotiation between hunger and disappointment. The menu rarely changed. Hard biscuits, overly salted beef, and the occasional spoonful of something pretending to be peas. Hard biscuits sound fine until you realize you needed an actual hammer to crack them open. Some pirates softened theirs by soaking them in cheap alcohol. Others politely ignored the bugs already living inside. Protein, I guess. Salted beef, meanwhile, wasn't really beef by the time pirates ate it. After months in a barrel, it turned into a chewy, salty fossil. Eating it required the same jaw strength as medieval torture devices. But you couldn't complain too much, because complaining meant fewer rations, and fewer rations meant immediate regret. Pirate democracy had limits. And because life at sea apparently wasn't painful enough, water was also a challenge. Fresh water didn't stay fresh for long. After a few weeks, it grew algae, went cloudy, and tasted like a swamp auditioning for a horror film. So hardy pirates, in a move of both practicality and total resignation, mostly drank alcohol. Not good alcohol, just whatever low-grade rum or beer they had shoved into a barrel before leaving port. Hydration and health were optional luxuries. Speaking of health, let's drift lazily into one of the pirate world's most persistent enemies: scurvy.
This lovely condition was the result of not eating vitamin C, because pirates weren't exactly loading their plates with citrus fruits and leafy greens. They were lucky if they had a lime, and that lime usually got thrown at someone or used for gambling before it ever saw a plate. Scurvy slowly turned your grums into a crime scene, made old wounds reopen for no reason, and ensured your joints creaked like poorly built furniture. It was the kind of disease that didn't kill quickly, it just lingered. Perfect for setting a sleepy mood, honestly. But scurvy wasn't the only problem. Pirates also dealt with dysentery, smallpox, unnamed fevers, and infections from their many unnecessary injuries. This was an age where medical treatment meant pouring rum on the wound while someone held you down. The ship surgeon usually had fewer tools than the average modern kitchen drawer. Amputations were common, and anesthesia was, well, it wasn't. You simply hoped you'd pass out at a convenient moment. Now, you might be thinking, surely pirate captains had it better. And yes, they did, slightly, but not by much. A captain had a little more food, maybe a softer bed, and the privilege of giving orders while pretending he wasn't worried about mutiny. Pirate crews were democracies in the loosest sense. If the captain got too mean, too bossy, or too boring, the crew could vote him out. Sometimes they marooned him on a tiny island. Sometimes they just politely replaced him with someone who didn't shout as much. Captaincy, therefore, was basically a customer service job with swords involved. You were constantly trying not to get fired, while also navigating storms, ship repairs, and the general emotional instability of men who had been stuck on a boat together for months. And let's drift over to one of the most surprising parts of pirate life, the rules. Yes, pirates had rules. They called them articles. Every crew wrote their own, like a very chaotic employee handbook. The articles covered everything from how to divide stolen goods to what happened if you injured another crew member during an argument. Many of the rules were more strict than you'd expect. No gambling on the ship, no fighting unless you agreed to settle it on land, no stealing from each other, and definitely no bringing flames near the gunpowder room unless you were actively trying to win an early Darwin Award. Punishments were unpleasant. Whippings were common, fines too. Sometimes you got marooned for a day or two, which was basically being put in timeout by the ocean. But pirates valued fairness. They weren't noble or kind, but they believed in equal shares. Everyone got a cut of the treasure, except in cases where someone thought they deserved a bit extra for doing something dramatic, like climbing the rigging during a storm or getting shot in a slightly heroic way. Another delightfully dreary part of pirate life was sleeping arrangements. Most of the crew slept wherever they could find space, on the floor, in hammocks, or curled up in corners like exhausted cats. Privacy did not exist. You could wake up with someone else's foot in your face, and the only thing you could do was quietly accept it. Pirates weren't known for personal boundaries. Weather didn't help either. A calm, sunny day could quickly turn into a lingering drizzle that lasted for weeks. Clothes never dried, the ship always smelled damp. Everything felt like it had been lightly dipped in seawater. Pirates essentially lived inside a wet basement with sails. But let's float gently over to one of the more ironic parts of the pirate lifestyle, their so-called freedom. Pirates loved to brag about their independence. They talked about escaping oppressive governments, breaking free from naval discipline, and carving out life under the black flag. In theory, lovely. In practice, they just traded one set of problems for a slightly louder, smellier set. Sure, no one could draft you into war, but you now lived on a ship where your mattress was a rope hammock, your shampoo was seawater, and your coworkers were men who solved arguments by biting. You were free, but free to suffer in exciting new ways. Still, pirates did have something most sailors didn't have: autonomy. Pirate captains couldn't do whatever they wanted. They needed the crew's approval. And in return, crew members could speak openly, vote on decisions, and decide where to sail. It wasn't a perfect democracy, but compared to the traditional Navy, which operated on the yell at them until they obey method, pirate life felt almost progressive. That said, pirate crews rarely agreed on anything without yelling anyway. A ship was a floating echo chamber of opinions, egos, and people who hadn't slept properly in days. Even the simplest vote could turn into a long, whiny debate, the kind that made everyone want to lie down and accept their fate. Now, let's lazily drift into the topic of pirate treasure. You know, the shiny gold coins and jewel-filled chests that every movie loves. In reality, treasure was usually cloth. Yes, fabric. Bales and bales of fabric. Affordable, practical, utterly boring cloth. Sometimes pirates stole spices or medicine, sometimes barrels of alcohol. Actual gold was rare. When pirates did find it, they didn't bury it. They spent it immediately on food, clothes, and spectacularly poor decisions in port towns. But on the ship itself, life stayed consistently unimpressive. You could be sailing with thousands of coins in the hold and still be eating your 15th consecutive meal of salted meat that tasted like sadness. Let's gently float into another underwhelming aspect of pirate existence: navigation. Pirates weren't master navigators. Some barely understood maps. Many couldn't read. So navigation often came down to pointing the ship in a direction and hoping for the best. Storms regularly pushed ships hundreds of miles off course, and when that happened, the crew had two options: blame the captain or blame the nearest unlucky soul who looked like they could handle accusations. Land sightings were rare moments of joy.
More like the ambiguous gray glow of too early to function. Most of the crew woke up groggy, tangled in their hammocks like overgrown, cranky toddlers. They didn't stretch majestically, they just sort of oozed downward, feet hitting the deck with a soft thud, followed immediately by a groan that suggested deep emotional regret. Breakfast was, unsurprisingly, underwhelming. If last night's hardtack still had its structural integrity, pirates considered that a win. Sometimes they added a splash of whatever alcohol was nearby to soften it, which really just turned it into a damp, slightly fermented cracker of despair. It did the job, but no one was writing cookbooks. The ship's cook, by the way, wasn't chosen for culinary skill. He was usually selected because he only had one hand, or one leg, or couldn't do much else. The logic was, well, he can't fight, might as well make the porridge. Extremely inspiring career trajectory. So breakfast often tasted like someone boiled sadness and then forgot seasoning existed. After eating, the crew got to work. And pirate work wasn't treasure hunting or sword fighting. It was tying knots, untying knots, fixing knots, checking on knots. It was knots all the way down. The ship was held together entirely by rope and optimism. And both needed constant maintenance. Pirates who knew how to tie the fancy knots were treated like minor celebrities. If someone could splice a rope quickly, the others watched like they were witnessing cutting-edge magic. Every now and then, pirates also had to fix leaks. Wooden ships leaked all the time, usually in the least convenient places. And fixing them meant climbing into dark, cramped spaces with tar, wood chips, and the hope that the ocean wouldn't suddenly decide to join the party. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the ship afloat, which was considered a high-priority goal. And then, once the chores were done, pirates went straight back to waiting. Waiting for a ship to appear. Waiting for the wind to change. Waiting for someone to stop snoring. Waiting for boredom to settle into its comfortable groove. Boredom, in fact, was such a dominant part of pirate life that the crew invented dozens of ways to pass time. Some carved little figures out of wood. Others played abstract games involving pebbles and arguments. Some stared at the horizon and contemplated absolutely nothing. Pirates were basically experts in the ancient art of zoning out. Reading was uncommon because, again, most pirates couldn't read. Books weren't exactly safe on a damp ship anyway. Pages got wet, ink smudged, and the whole thing smelled like mildew. So if someone did bring a book aboard, it became the ship's communal treasure. People protected it more fiercely than actual gold. And because entertainment options were limited, pirates talked a lot. Hours of stories. Some real, some exaggerated, some clearly made up by bored men who wanted to sound cooler than they were. Tales of sea monsters, ghost ships, cursed islands, and women who probably didn't exist. Pirates told stories so often that half of them probably forgot which parts were true. And in between the stories came singing. Pirate songs weren't the energetic tavern chants Hollywood gives us. They were more like low, mumbled tunes sung by tired men in questionable moods. Soft, slow, slightly off-key. Exactly the vibe you'd want before bed. But even with all the boredom, there were practical concerns, like keeping the ship armed. Pirates spent a surprising amount of time cleaning their cannons. Not because they loved them, but because the cannons loved to rust. Iron and salty air are not friends. So, swabbing cannons and maintaining pistols became weekly rituals. Not exciting, but necessary. The pistols, by the way, were hilariously unreliable. They fired maybe half the time? Maybe. And when they didn't fire, pirates just threw them aside and grabbed another. Gun accuracy wasn't a thing. Pirates stood about 10 feet from their targets, closed one eye dramatically, pulled the trigger, and hoped physics felt generous that day. Blades were more reliable but still required maintenance. Swords were cleaned daily, sharpened weekly, and used for everything from cutting rope to slicing hardtack. Pirates treated their cutlasses like multi-tools. But that also meant they dulled quickly, which led to the weekly ritual of complaining about how much work everything was. Let's drift slowly into another lovely reality of pirate life: storms. If the weather turned bad, there was literally nothing pirates could do except accept it. The ship rocked violently, rain poured, winds howled, waves crashed over the deck. Everything that soaked, everyone got miserable, and pirates just held onto ropes for dear life while mentally preparing their wills. No one slept during storms. You just clung to something sturdy, tried not to slide dramatically across the deck, and hoped the ocean wasn't in the mood for ship snacks. Storms were equal parts terrifying and exhausting. But when they were over, assuming the ship survived, pirates celebrated with long, silent naps that barely recuperated anything. After storms, repairs began immediately. Sails tore easily, masts cracked, rope frayed, barrels rolled around and smashed into things. The deck became a chaotic puzzle of broken pieces, and pirates spent days putting everything back together, slowly, grumbling the entire time. And then, finally, when everything seemed calm, there was always the looming threat of disease again. Because moisture plus tired men plus zero hygiene equals things no one wanted to think about. The sick were usually quarantined in the lower deck, which must have smelled like a haunted swamp. Ventilation wasn't exactly a feature of pirate ships, so the air just sat there. Thick, humid, slightly toxic. Sometimes out of desperation or boredom, the surgeon tried experimental treatments, which usually involved herbs he vaguely recognized or substances he definitely didn't. Surprisingly, some pirates survived anyway, mostly due to luck. Now, for pirates who made it back to port, life got temporarily better. They could walk on solid land, which felt like a spa experience. Some spent their earnings on food that didn't break their teeth. Others bought new clothes, drank way too much, or, classic move, gambled it all away within 20 minutes. Pirate money had a shorter lifespan than most houseplants. But the moment pirates stepped back onto the ship, everything reset. Same hammocks, same chores, same existential questions, same slow, dragging routine that defined their entire career. Pirate life wasn't a sprint. It was a long, sleepy, moderately uncomfortable trudge. And yet, some pirates absolutely adored this existence. They liked the camaraderie, the independence, the routine, and the weird rhythm of ocean life. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fun, but it was theirs. And for many of them, that was enough. Still, we haven't even drifted into the deeper misery of actual pirate battles yet. Don't worry, we'll do it gently, with the least dramatic tone possible. Because even pirate fights were mostly chaos mixed with exhaustion.